another of our Tuesday night lecture series, which are co-sponsored by the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and the Humanities here at Bard and the Human Rights Project. Tonight we have a visitor from the European College of Liberal Arts at Bard, or Bard. I still have to figure out how to say that. ECLA at Bard. Florian, how do I say it?
ECLA at Bard.
What?
I think it's off, not at.
ECLA of Bard. Of Bard, or what? So we're gonna have to figure the terminology out, I gather. But I was there in February for a wonderful event they have in Berlin at ECLA called State of the World Week, in which they bring in 5 speakers over a week to lead programs on a particular topic. It was censorship this year. It was a lot of fun. One of my hosts is our speaker tonight, who's a guest professor at ECLA of Bard, who's been there for 2 years, and shares a lot of common interests with us at the Hannah Arendt Center in philosophy, politics, and generally trying to think about relevant problems in the world. Michael Weinman, as I said, is a guest professor at ECLA. He's written 2 books. The first is Language, Time, and Identity. The first is Pleasure in Aristotle's Ethics. And the second, which just came out, and we have here, is Language, Time, and Identity in Woolf's The Waves. His talk today is titled Pedagogy or Demagogy, the Dangerous Dunamis of the Rhetor's Art. I hope this is the first of many such exchanges between ECLA of Bard and Bard. And please welcome Michael Weinman.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. My subject is the power of composed speech. While it is by no means unusual to note that rhetoric is terribly powerful, I believe you might hear something uncommon tonight. For, while most discussions of the influence of rhetoric focus on the ways in which it distracts, distorts, and dissembles, in short, on the ways that rhetoric minimizes or even abolishes the power of truth in political discourse, I aim tonight, drawing upon the classical analysis of the speaker's art offered by Aristotle, to sing its song of praise. I shall not pretend that the common attacks on rhetoric are false. Rather, as I will show, it is precisely because they are true that we need to cherish and cultivate this art, albeit in a fashion diametrically opposed in the manner of the antistrophe to the way it is generally practiced. If rhetoric is generally practiced as the tool of the demagogue, mine is the praise of the antistrophic rhetoric of the pedagogue. Decrying the tool itself because of its demagogic use, I shall try to persuade you, undermines our own capacity to deploy the tool pedagogically at our peril. Before I begin my attempt, let me offer a word about why I am making it in the first place, and why here and now in particular. At the risk of seeming glib, I shall describe the ground of our rhetorical situation this evening as the 3 A's, meaning Aristotle, Arendt, and America. These 3 are connected, for me, and insofar as you will allow it, for you too, at least tonight, in this way. Not so many years ago, I wrote my dissertation, later a book, about Aristotle's understanding of pleasure in the good life, arguing that it shows how and why we must account for that which encompasses the human being in making claims about what is good for the human being. This was only possible because of assistance provided by the Hannah Arendt Dissertation Fellowship at the New School for Social Research. This fellowship itself was possible only because the New School had earlier been a home for exiled intellectuals, largely but not exclusively Jewish, during and after the Nazi regime. There are many other ways one could connect these three A's. With your forbearance, however, I would like us to hold this particular story, woven out of these particular parts, as that which brings us together here tonight to hear with one another about the dangerous dunamis of rhetoric under the aegis of Hannah Arendt. This attachment to these three A's will unfold very rapidly, to be honest, through a discussion of Aristotle's defense of rhetoric as a theoretical art with practical import. Here, making two steps, for those taking notes. Oh, wait. Here, making two steps, each of which has two steps. I aim to move from, one, Aristotle's recognition of the need for speech that persuades as speech, and not just speech that persuades insofar as it demonstrates infallible truth, to, two, his full-throated defense of precisely the kind of rhetorical manipulation of our affective comportment that many in classical times and now decry. From there, section 2, I will turn to Arendt's account of the fragility of truth in her epochal essay, Truth and Politics. Here I will recount her account and point to its perspicacity in 4 steps, beginning with the initial distinction between truth and opinion, and closing with the role of persuasive speech and action in establishing moral facts, what she calls moral facts, as judgments. Finally, in the 3rd section, we return to America. Here, I will begin with Daniel Patrick Moynihan's deeply Arendtian pronouncement that we are all entitled to our own opinions, but not our own facts. And through 3 successive steps, we'll arrive at a closing suggestion about what to do in our own historically situated moment in light of the trans-historical truth that there is no hope of establishing practical truths absent persuasive speech. Before turning to my 3 A's, permit me one closing remark. Okay, now we're talking. I have stressed in this prologue, as I am sure you have noted, the extent to which any possible effect that my reasoned speech might have on you tonight is dependent upon yourselves and your own informed consent to my continuing to speak. Think of how often in the short space I have said, let me, permit me, if you will have it, and so on. I ask you to underscore the note I presume you have already made of this. We shall return to it at the conclusion of my remarks. So section 1, and I'm going to be fast, I'll confess, but you have the handout in front of you now. Aristotle's first words in Rhetoric made clear that it is a reply to Gorgias, in italics, and Gorgias, not in italics. He states, quote, "Rhetoric is an antistrophos, a counterpart, like the second half chorus dancing in reply to the first chorus strophos in a tragic choral ode. Rhetoric is an antistrophos to dialectic. Where Plato-Socrates in the Gorgias tells us that rhetoric is such a counterpart to cooking, with the difference that rhetoric serves the soul, while cooking serves the body. Aristotle places rhetoric in a counterpart relation with dialectic, meaning that it must be serving a purpose structurally similar and, one might presume, no less valuable to that of dialectic. Bearing in mind that dialectic does nothing less than make the very certainty of certain knowledge possible. Topics 100a 30 to b24 makes this claim. One can see at once that this would be quite an apologia, quite a defense of rhetoric. But we must be careful. What do we mean when I say dialectic makes the very certainty of certain knowledge possible? I very much do not mean that Aristotle means to say that dialectic makes it possible for certain knowledge to be absolute, clear, distinct, unequivocal, and so on. Rather, with this very certainty, I stress, and Aristotle stresses, the being a certain one and not another one of all knowledge, even and especially when we speak of knowledge of the universal. The certainty of certain knowledge means knowledge belongs to this moment here, right now, in this particular situated discourse. This discourse itself, a body of knowledge, the residue of prior discourse, which proceeds from certain established opinions. This is what Aristotle calls the endoxa, not the doxa, not the opinions that we hold, but the endoxa, the opinions that we breathe and we live in, via certain situated, dialectically arranged arguments that he calls topoi, places, they're in a certain place, to arrive at rational conviction, embodied in an awareness that is according to the whole, katholu, universal, by means of practical judgment, phronesis, or sophia, wisdom. Say you are persuaded, even if only for the sake of the argument, about these two claims I've just made. 1, dialectic makes the certainty of knowledge possible. 2, rhetoric is somehow doing the same thing with its differently constituted discursive situation. If so, the time has come to ask, how does this work in the case of rhetoric? For this we turn to a lightning quick textual analysis of the opening chapters of the first book of the Rhetoric. So, how to see? This is what you have, I hope, in front of you. More or less immediately after this moment that I began with, a little dance, we get a picture thrown out in front of us that knowledge is about the relationship of the universal and the particular. Okay, so truth will always somehow be about the way that the particular relates to the universal, insofar as knowledge is that which discloses truth. But truth alone cannot persuade. There are many situations that a human being finds herself or himself in which the truth is not sufficient. Okay, 2. So we might turn to rhetoric, but we have this problem. What's the problem? There are these people who go around talking about, and in some cases writing, treatises about the so-called art of rhetoric. And they're vacuous. Aristotle acknowledges that they're vacuous. He says that they're vacuous because none of them recognizes the role of what he calls an enthymeme, which is, I have no, which is, we'll talk about it later. Okay, right, so let's talk about it now. 3, what is an enthymeme? An enthymeme is a syllogism, kind of. Okay? It's basically a syllogism, except that you don't put everything in. And you don't put everything in because putting everything in would require consent to things that you know will not receive consent. Should they receive consent, point 1 wouldn't be true. But point 1 is true. Okay, you get the picture. So an enthymeme is a syllogism for all those situations where truth doesn't persuade. And further, the same dunamis, this is the central claim, really. The same dunamis, the same power, capacity, ability of the soul sees what is true and what is like to the true. Similar to the true. 355a, 3 to 17. This is a very difficult passage, and we can talk more about it later. But what he's basically saying, seems to me, is that opinion is much more like truth than it's unlike truth. And this is maybe the way that he's really making clear his stance with Plato's Gorgias. Okay, next claim, once we've gotten past the introduction of the enthymeme and the idea that prior arts of rhetoric are deficient because they don't recognize the role of the enthymeme. Rhetoric helps what is true and is by nature stronger appear to public gatherings who might otherwise take the weaker for the stronger. Okay, that's what rhetoric does. 2, teaching, instruction, what you do in the scientific treatises, for instance, what Aristotle attempts to, aspires to, in the so-called scientific treatises, teaching does something like that. Okay, it helps the truth come out. And it does it more purely, but not everyone is capable of having the truth disclosed to them by teaching. Only rhetoric, step 5, only rhetoric and dialectic where possible can fill the gap identified here. Okay. Rhetoric, now we're ready to get a definition of rhetoric. You can see definition of rhetoric comes in 6th. It comes not at the beginning of the 1st chapter, it comes at the beginning of the 2nd chapter. Rhetoric is the dunamis of seeing, rhetoric is the power of seeing what can be persuasive on a subject in a certain situation. That's Aristotle's definition of rhetoric. It's a power of seeing. It's a theoretical art. The verb there is there. It's a power of seeing. It comes in 2 kinds, artful and inartful. Artful rhetoric must be discovered, and it involves the speech itself being persuasive. Inartful sources of persuasion, inartful rhetoric, is the use of things like the bloody knife. You have to convict someone, you have a bloody knife, you show the bloody knife. Not a lot of art in that. Another example is evidence obtained by torture, which tells you something interesting about inartful rhetoric. Okay. 3rd set of claims. There are 3 kinds of rhetoric. This is chapter 3, by the way. 1 through 3 is chapter 1. 4 through 7 is the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2. 7 through 9 is chapter 2. There are 3 kinds of rhetoric for 3 kinds of materials of persuasion. You have the speaker's character, you have the audience's disposition, and you have the speech itself. Where epigoge is used, where example or induction is used, depends upon certain things. Where an enthymeme is used depends upon certain other things. And where you introduce the relationship of the universal and the particular depends upon certain arrangements of these 3 materials of persuasion. The last claim, rhetoric reasons from endoxa. Rhetoric sometimes uses syllogism. Reasoning is sometimes toward necessity. When it's toward necessity, it uses dialectic. Sometimes toward likelihood. That's when we use the enthymemes. That's when we rely on rhetoric. and we understand the difference and the cause of the difference. Okay, that's the picture that the first 3 chapters of Rhetoric lay out. Okay. In light of this picture, in the second book, and this is the second step, and I'll be super brief here, Aristotle comes out to talk about the ways in which the audience's disposition, what was number 2 on that list of the 3 materials of persuasion, can best be used. And this involves our affective comportment, our passions, or our emotions, the pathe, right? So all of our path words, sympathy, empathy, apathy. Book 2 reiterates the book 1 claims that we've already looked at. Rhetoric persuades if and only if the truth-disclosing speech can reach the hearers, which means only if the character of the speaker is presented in a relatable way. The reason for this, he says, this is the first claim in the second step, is that there are 3 things that make us feel trust. Right? Trust is the beginning of all truth disclosure. These are judgment, virtue, and goodwill. So how do you bring about the trust in those who are listening to you? Well, passions, okay, are all the sources of change on account of which people differ in their judgments that are accompanied by pain and pleasure. So what you want to do is get people to share your judgment. And the way that you're going to get them to share your judgment is to get them to feel the right way about you. You want them to share in your pains and your pleasures. Right? We, as Americans, had a president in recent memory who understood that very well. What do we do next? We define anger. And we can talk about Aristotle's definition of anger if you like. We put 2 stipulations on this definition that I think are crucial. One is that anger must be directed at one person in particular. And 2 is that the one who is angry cherishes a wish for possible revenge. Remember that. If you're angry, you must be cherishing a wish for possible revenge. If you don't find yourself cherishing a wish for possible revenge, you're not angry. 3 forms of belittling constitute grounds for anger: contempt, spite, and hubris, presumption. I don't know, presumption's too minimal. Big-time presumption. Right? And what's crucial to note here is that the second and third of these 2 stipulations on the definition of anger is to stir people to recall the occasions on which they themselves were angry. Right? And this becomes still more explicit, and this is what 4, 5, and 6 attempt to show out. The entire remainder of the chapter on anger is basically a series of lists of things that make you angry. Okay? And I'm not going to go through all of it now in the interest of time. To come to 6, right? This layering upon layering approach, we might say in our American idiom that he's laying it on a little thick. In his anger-producing presentation of anger, and how it is produced, and under which circumstances, and what accelerates the production, comes to a head when Aristotle concludes his discussion of anger thus: "And it is evident that by one's speech, one might need to prepare people of the same sort as those feeling prone to anger, and to present one's opponents as guilty of those things which cause people to get angry, and being the sort of people at whom they get angry." In hearing this, we must be sensitive to how Aristotle's manner of presentation is intended as a performative demonstration both of the account of anger itself, but also what sorts of things cause us to be angry. That is, Aristotle's account of anger is an account of itself. It made you angry, and then it said to you, this is how I made you angry. What Aristotle is saying through this performative demonstration comes to this, I think. Character cultivation is impossible without the proper affective structures in the soul. of the one who is to be cultivated. Such structures depend on rhetoric more than anything else. Thus, character cultivation, and hence virtuous citizens, depends more on the proper use of rhetoric than anything else. The point is not to provide a public discursive space free of, say, anger, but rather to show people who speak to others and who are to be spoken to by others how to cultivate anger in the ways that are most conducive to the work of the enthymemic demonstration that was spoken about in Book 1. Okay, now that we've settled the first two books of the Rhetoric in like 17 minutes, 5 minutes on Arendt. 4 steps. The first step to begin with is that crucial for Arendt in Truth and Politics is the relationship between truth and opinion. And she identifies Plato's Gorgias, Plato's Republic, or Plato's engagement with rhetoric as a focus, both historically and in our own moment, of the understanding of the tension between truth and politics, which, in her words, right, are opposed because of the opposition between the citizens' ever-changing opinions about human affairs, which themselves were in constant flux, and the truth about those things, which in their very nature were everlasting, and from which, therefore, principles could be derived to stabilize human affairs. Right? So that's Arendt's Plato. You have the ever-changing opinions constantly in flux, and you have those things which never change, about which there is truthful knowledge, and these are and will always be in opposition. And insofar as politics is about opinions that are constantly in flux, there is no space in politics for truth unless politics were to simply submit itself to the truth disclosed by the philosopher. And so step 2. Having established this cornerstone of the historical opposition between truth and opinion, Arendt goes on to show how, in the early modern period, a series of thinkers, but also the great revolutionary Madison, undid this opposition and offered a way out of the necessary tension between truth and opinion. Right? They did so with everything except what one might have thought to be the easiest thing. Right? We're allowed to differ, and we're allowed to recognize the value in our differing views about things of great matter, like the nature of the universe and the relationship of the human and the divine, and all kinds of things that are terribly tough to come to respect difference about. But what we absolutely can't come to a similar agreement about is factual truth. And so factual truth is greeted today, she says, with greater hostility than ever before. And in the backdrop of her pointing that out, of course, as she mentions at the beginning of the piece, is the response to which she was subjected when she published Eichmann in Jerusalem. Her central contention is that our commitment as scientists, philosophers, political actors, and those influenced by these 3 groups of opinion makers to the fallibility of reason provides a flexible solution to the classical conflict between truth and opinion with respect to the first 3 classes of the true. Right? So we can disagree about rational truth, we can disagree about scientific truth, we can disagree about moral truth. But we cannot come to some kind of accommodation about factual truth. So either we live in a world that is shaped by factual truth, or we live in a world that has no factual truth. And such a world, as we come to see, is no world at all. So here's step 3, where I want to just hold together the way that Arendt reflects on Jefferson's and Socrates' related moral truths. Jefferson's that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, as opposed to Socrates' moral truth that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. Right? Socrates understands this as a truth and not an opinion. And because he understands it this way, the only means at his disposal for bringing it to the political community was to set an example of himself. Such teaching by example, she says, is the only form of persuasion that philosophical truth is capable of without perversion or distortion. This is the only chance for an ethical principle to be verified as well as validated. And this last claim, that's Arendt's determination, this last claim points to the crucial difference between Socrates' statement and Jefferson's statement. The former, as principles with the status of truth, are susceptible to verification as well as vindication. At the same time, it is precisely this greater epistemic potency that they have which makes them far less potent politically. An opinion submitted to the political community can be validated, but it can never be verified. While a truth so submitted stands a chance of being verified, but far more likely, we would find the former to be validated and the latter to never be validated or verified. The last step, the role of persuasive speech and act in establishing moral truths like Socrates' as judgments. Arendt presses her analysis about the political valence of factual truth to a conclusion by means of the investigation of the liar, beginning with the perhaps surprising gesture of calling our ability to lie, quote, this little miracle. The lie, the possibility of willingly lying, is a miracle because it puts the lie, so to speak, to those philosophies, she has in mind psychological behavioralism above all, that imagine us to be, quote, thoroughly conditioned in our behavior. But while lying has been a feature of political life since before anyone knew what political life was, there is a unique element to the deliberate falsehood in the 20th century context of mass media and totalized politics. It is only here and now, Arendt says, that we confront the phenomenon, or even the possibility of the phenomenon, of a community that, quote, has embarked on organizing lying on principle, and not only with respect to particulars, which makes truthfulness as such a political factor of the first order. The rule truth, or its lack, plays in building the world, progresses for Arendt in 3 steps. First, there is the recognition that if the modern political lies are so big that they require a reinvention of the whole factual texture, what prevents these news stories, images, and non-facts from becoming an adequate substitute for reality and factuality? You don't need Baudrillard, okay? I know he's sexy, but it's there in Arendt. That is, in a totalized political environment, a total distortion of fact is possible. In fact, it's easier than a non-total distortion of fact, right? If you're going to distort, you got to get on. Okay, you get it. In the face of this, Those who wish to serve both the truth and their fellow citizens are charged with maintaining a very delicate balance in their thought and act. She says, the political attitude toward facts must indeed tread the very narrow path between the danger of taking them as the results of some necessary development which men could not prevent and about which they could therefore do nothing at all, and the danger of denying them, of trying to manipulate them out of the world. That's step 2. Finally, there is a crucial role for 2 particular institutions, she says, the academy and the judiciary, in determining the contours of this very narrow path in lived experience. These 2 institutions, she says, like other refuges of truth, have remained exposed to all the dangers arising from social and political power. At the same time, the chances for truth to prevail in public are greatly improved by the mere existence of such places and the organization of independent, supposedly disinterested scholars associated with them. While this might give us the impression that Arendt is a believer in the professionalized understanding of intellectual labors as defenders of truth against the masses of ignorance and the distorted media, what Arendt actually finds when turning to these institutions is the space for the persistence of the kind of person who says what is. And such a person, whether acting in the judicial scene or in the academic scene or elsewhere, but such places are hard to find, quote, always tells a story. And in this story, the particular facts lose their contingency and acquire some humanly comprehensible meaning. This conclusion of hers stresses what we saw stressed in Aristotle's account of the possibility to disclose truth in public context, and what I, here tonight, am trying to underscore. The public disclosure of the true, or what is like the true, requires affective, non-rational elements that need to be embraced by the would-be truth-teller and not rejected as an embarrassment. Finally, America. And this will be real quick. Nothing to see here. When Daniel Patrick Moynihan says everyone is entitled to his own opinions but not to his own facts, he is expressing, I find, the core of Arendt's essay. It is simply not possible to live in the same world with people who claim facts about the constitution of one's historically situated reality that differ from those that one holds to be true. You cannot, to cite Arendt's examples, believe that Belgium invaded Germany in August of 1914. Nor, as Arendt quotes Adenauer speculating, the barbarism of National Socialism had affected only a relatively small percentage of the country. Or, again, Arendt's example, that Trotsky played no role in the Russian Revolution. You cannot live in the same world as those who say such things to be the case. Increasingly, however, America seems to find itself and its citizens to be a factless land, a place where, in fact, we do have many groups who live in their own bubbles constituted by their own conception of factual reality. What Moynihan already detected as a possible development seems now to be a virtually irresistible and irreversible fact. To deny which, to deny would be to deny the reality of our own lives. Step 2. In the face of this factless, cynical society, we have, for 30 years or so, seen a call for a rhetoric-free discourse, which would stick to the facts through the use of a pure, rule-bound use of practical reason in the public discussion of matters of public concern. I have in mind figures and movements such as Habermas and the Deliberative Democrats, Sandel and value-based communal democracy, Lessig and the call for a new constitutional convention. And we can talk about those examples that you could think of. But that's the world I want to present to you. Step 3. That world has it wrong. The fundamental error in this understandable drive toward a rational, ideally purely rational discursive space in which to forward our interests and address our conflicts, as both Aristotle and Arendt were aware, is that absent the rhetorical, the distortive, the manipulative element of speech, the storytelling element of speech, as Arendt points out, there is no discursive space that is capable of touching the world, let alone the world as it appears to human beings who must make judgments about how to act in the world. Right? Aristotle points to this as he concludes his discussion of the ways in which rhetoric must attend to affect and to character, he says. So, seeing as how the use of persuasive rhetoric must seeing how the use of persuasive speeches is toward judgment, and this is the case even if the one using the speech is giving an exhortation or a warning to a single person, and that's finger pointing at Socrates. Even if the one using the speech is giving an exhortation to a single person in private, as it were. And just as much, whether one is speaking against opponents or against a proposition, the ways and means by which speeches need to be made are suited to the listener's characters. Far from hiding from the manipulative elements of this kind of persuasion, Aristotle's account acknowledges it, emphasizes it, and performatively demonstrates how we can act it. The importance of this can be seen in a passage from the close of the first chapter, where Aristotle says that sophistry, okay, that's Arendt's lyre, the little miracle of Arendt's lyre, is present not in the dunamis of rhetoric, but in the intention, except that here one person will be a rhetorician on the basis of knowledge, and another on the basis of intention, while someone who is skilled at dialectic, not on the basis of intention, but on the basis of dunamis. In other words, the rhetorician becomes a mean between the extremes of the sophist, the willing liar, and the dialectician, the philosopher. Aristotle positions rhetoric precisely as the kind of theoretical art that Arendt calls for in her search for a non-political activity that can nevertheless assist the truth to enter the political world and thereby help to preserve a common world based on shared facts. This brings us to step 4. Here, emphasizing the commitment I have shown to the kind of self-conscious rhetoric I understand to be articulated and defended in Aristotle's work, and my submission of this commitment for your consideration as something to similarly embrace, I would like for you to join me in the recognition of rhetoric as our only hope in bringing about virtue in the souls of our fellow citizens. For without this, there is no opportunity for getting started any project of civic renewal, republicanism, deliberative or radical democracy, or anything else to which we might be committed as thoughtful people and as citizens. However much we might want to rationalize society in Habermas's sense, however much we might welcome Republic 2.0, however much we might wish to remake and extend the influence of a public philosophy in Sandel's sense, I hope to have persuaded you that our greatest hope for taking up such projects ourselves, or in endorsing them for others to take up, is through the cultivation of our capacities as practitioners of the never solely rational, but always theoretical art called rhetoric. I have an example, but never mind. I'll say this much, right? Examples: anger. There was a piece on NPR, Americans are angry, very angry. This was on Valentine's Eve, so the 13th of February. Maybe some of you heard it. It's by Kevin Weeks, I believe. And basically the idea is America is angry, very angry, and maybe it's not all bad. And the basic idea of the piece is to say, all this talk about getting over our anger, maybe it's a little too fast. We got over our anger during the Reconstruction period, and that led to Jim Crow. Something like that is the argument. What I basically want to say to Weeks, so I go through his account and I say that's fair enough, but actually he's not nearly happy enough about anger. He's still far too ready, right? Why that's not all bad. What he should say is why that's great, is what I'm saying. But I'll spare you all the details of that and cut to the chase. What is my proposal in response to Weeks, then? My proposal is, let us be angry. Let us bring ourselves into the public arena. Let us appear, in Arendt's sense, fully dressed in the clothing of our characters. Let us disclose these effective resonances of our judgments to one another mutually, across the boundaries that divide us ideologically, temperamentally, religiously. Let us publicly and passionately disagree, rather than simply blogging to our friends and fellow travelers who we know are angry about the same things we are. When we meet our peers in public, we risk ourselves. When we attempt to regulate the discursive situation in which the political is to unfold, we abolish precisely that risk. We might, to be sure, have a more civil discourse, in the disemboweled sense that that word has come to have. No one throws anything. But there would be no more civitas. There would be nothing in which to display such civility. Better by far simply to fail as a polity, because our characters are too different, because we simply don't want to live together, than to fail as a polity because we have convinced ourselves that it is better to determine in advance the rules by which we will try to agree and disagree with one another. If we don't want to agree about how to agree and disagree, better to show each other why and see why that happens than to say, okay, let's sit down, let's be rational, etc. That's why it's good that we can still recognize that we are angry. What we should do with that anger, as Weeks says, is not get over it. But more than not getting over it, we ought to channel it in the way that my imagined interlocutors might suggest. We should be angry publicly and at great risk to ourselves and to others. Epilogue. I promised at the outset that I would tell you, by way of conclusion, why I have so painstakingly loaded my remarks with reminders that the achievement of my end is contingent upon your informed consent to hear my words and make them in some sense your own. This is true of composed speech in general, but it is especially appropriate to bear in mind when assessing the role of rhetoric in civic life. For those who attack rhetoric because of its potency to bring us to the lowest common denominator, prove themselves wrong. Either they make this claim in a properly rhetorical fashion, in which they persuade us with our knowing consent that rhetoric ought to be abandoned, abolished, shunned, or they make it by using fear or hate or some other extraneous motivation. In the first case, by persuading us reasonably that rhetoric has this power, they have shown that it has the opposite power as well. In the latter case, they have either not persuaded us at all, or if they have done so demagogically, in which case they will have demonstrated the wrongness of what they themselves have done. My aim, in a perfectly antistrophic mode, is to say that if they can show or display what they aim to, it is by the same means that I can show the opposite. This ought not to cause us to be cynics about the power of composed speech. It ought rather to motivate us to think carefully about the premises from which our enthymemes begin and to what exactly it is that we wish to appeal in the characters of our audience. And to act accordingly. Thank you very much.
So we have about half an hour for questions. I'll let you take questions. You want me to do it?
Thomas, Jeff, Bill. Jeff, yeah?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you so much for this rich and complex talk. I wanted to zoom in on the Arendt part, so your third part around step 4, because I love your quote of the ability to lie is this little miracle, and I thought it brought up a kind of brilliant contrast between the emphasis on facts that we hear in Arendt. And I wanted to ask, of course, this language of the miracle is also the language of the human condition, and I wanted to ask you if you thought that thinking about this particular lie, how that might relate to action in the human condition, and especially how, in a larger sense, that relates to the kind of idea of freedom, especially in contrast to these big political lies that kind of go too far. They're the other extreme. It's fascinating how Arendt holds that tension between these kind of lies.
Yeah.
And then, if you'd like to go another step, I was thinking about the relationship between rhetoric and this factual texture that you quote, a kind of weaving of discourse, and how rhetoric forms that plot.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, so on about the miracle, I suspect that what she's saying, right, is that this is one kind of phenomenon. It's delicate. It's a very narrow path, but it's one place where she would put her finger on that capacity of human beings to make us go, huh, right? I wasn't expecting that. So a lie is a miracle. Trotsky played no role in the Russian Revolution. Wouldn't have thought. Now, that's a miracle, and only we do that, right? Like stars don't do that. But, you get the idea. I won't do a little song and dance about how great we are. But, only we say that Trotsky played no role in the Russian Revolution and then, kill 6 million people. Exactly right. So I do think that's exactly what you said. That and to act accordingly at the end of the epilogue is to say that every time we speak, and especially those of us who think about what we speak and to whom we're speaking, we lie. Or let's say we have to weave a story, okay, to not speak pejoratively of it, and that story will emphasize certain things at the expense of other things, and if it's successful, right, the way that we tell a story will bring about a recognition in those to whom we tell the story that they would not have known they might come to when we began to speak. But it's a very narrow path because while you must allow yourself some space, in which to construct the reality that you want to present to those who are listening to you, you must also be respectful enough of facts as to not contribute to a factless world. But what I see, this was moving super fast, and Truth and Politics obviously deserves far more time, and so on and so forth. But the idea of the shift from the third to the fourth step in my encounter with Arendt here is to say that she's not suggesting that the academy and the judiciary are the places where facts get disclosed and the public decides to take it or leave it. What she's saying is that these are the places where stories can be told. and they are outside of the power centers of mass society. And so I suspect that what she's seeing is it's this capacity to create these unexpected moments of recognition in our fellow citizens that are terribly close to being lies. With the weaving, what I think is happening is that I think that there's a very great sympathy between what Arendt's saying in that movement in her essay toward its conclusion and what Aristotle's saying in kind of getting the project of rhetoric going, which is to say the truth is stronger, and the truth is not up to us. But the way in which truth can appear to all of us is contingent on some of us who understand ourselves as having understood the truth, can help others who are not capable of being taught. And I think Arendt thinks that way as well as Aristotle. I don't know if I agree, but at least on those occasions I would agree with the two of them. On those occasions where teaching is impossible, there's got to be another way. And that involves fabrication, to use that word. And if fabrication isn't lying, it's very close. So I don't know if that helped. But I think you're right to say that that goes both ways. That thought about the miracle of the liar goes to the thinking of freedom in action elsewhere in Arendt's work, but it also goes sort of toward the Aristotle section of the talk and the idea of how you are going to cultivate a certain disposition in your audience in order to prepare them for the truth to be disclosed to them. Thomas.
First, thanks for a terrifically rich talk, which is, I'm studying the ethics now with students who are in the room. It's really helpful and exciting. I want to ask two questions, which are actually related to what Jeff was asking. The first of which I think probably has a fairly easy answer. The second of which is probably you're going to say, haven't understood anything. But with that preface, the first is step one, part one, step one, the central item, only rhetoric, and dialectic where possible. And what I'm wondering is about what goes in the parentheses there, and particularly, is the possibility dependent on the capacity of the individual? Is that what we're talking about, or is it a different kind of possible? What is the significance of that possible? And then the second question is, I loved this, if I understood correctly, that Aristotle's rhetoric is, Arendt's storytelling is the saying what is, the saying of what, and I want to think about it more, but if I understand correctly, you're saying that Aristotle's project with the rhetoric is equivalent to Arendt's idea of the storyteller, which is the one who says what is. And this question is directly related to Jeff. The question is then, and what's always puzzled me about that is just the obvious thing, which is that distinguishing the story that is saying what is from the story that's the big lie. And what I'm wondering is if you would say that the saying what is different from knowing what is. And if that's the case, is there some way in which knowing what is can be agreed upon? Is there some space in which that kind of conversation happens that's distinct from the saying what is rhetorical space? And these questions might obviously be related.
These questions are related, obviously. What was I supposed to say? Right, well that's very simple. And haven't you understood anything? Okay, are we done? No, they're related. We're not going to try the dialectic thing. Never with them. Not because there are 40 of us here. It's one here, but they're just some people. It's just not going to work. But I don't think you need to take that on board to take the argument on board, which is that what he really means is that dialectic is only possible where knowledge is possible. So dialectic is a method, it's a path one can travel, or it's a path that one is always already having traveled, whatever, however you want to try and think of what methodos is. So dialectic is a method for knowing what is true. So that's why your two questions, I think, really are the same question, right? And that's Aristotle's. I mean, that's what he's got for you on that bit, right? And what that means is that what does dialectic do? Dialectic is the successive operation of syllogisms. So dialectic doesn't happen in the scientific treatises, or whatever you want to call them, in the majority of the treatises. Rhetoric is an enthymemic treatise. That's a text analysis. I mean, that's the suggestion that I'm making, is that rhetoric proceeds enthymemically. It's a performative demonstration of what an enthymeme is. He leaves out things that he knows cannot arrive at consent. Because dialectic, what does dialectic do? It starts from two statements that have consent and shows that the premise of the one entails the conclusion of the other, and thus vice versa. Right? It's not two statements and then a third thing that follows the way that we teach the syllogism. It's an extreme and mean proportion between two claims. But the two claims have to have prior consent. I'm sorry, that's kind of technical. But that's knowledge. And sometimes that's not possible. When is it not possible? When there isn't reasoned consent about the two claims. That might be because the people who are there aren't capable of it. Aristotle certainly believes that. But it might also be true for reasons that I think we could all agree about. And so, I don't know if I'm going to do everything with the second question, but then the idea would be, and so, because there are certain circumstances, which is to say, basically everywhere, all the time, always, in which knowledge is not possible, what we have is truth-telling. And truth-telling is enthymemic demonstration, where you lead people to certain conclusions through a rational procedure, but through a rational procedure that operates on certain genuinely agreed upon convictions, and then flavors them with affective irrational dispositions that bring about in the soul of the person so spoken to conviction about other claims. So instead of taking claims and showing that if you believe both these two claims, you must believe this other thing, what enthymemic demonstration does is say, hey, look at this claim, and then here I'm going to do a song and dance and make you angry, therefore you have to kill this person. Better example, therefore we must not kill this person. No, but I mean, that kind of a thing. There's no way of knowing if someone's guilty or not. There's no way of knowing.
But any discursive expression, or any the discursive realm in which that that kind of exchange happens is always rhetorical.
Yes. Okay. Which is why we don't have any, there's no piece of text in the Aristotelian corpus. Very, 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 they're minute, very, in thousands of lines of Aristotle, you can find a few lines of rational demonstration, of knowledge. So even in the analytics, there are some places where truly rational demonstration happens, but most of the, think of the way that, anyway, but yes, that's the idea. Because that's discourse, whether they're lecture, who the hell knows, but because it's discourse, it's not the time or place for that. It's only when you really sit down with someone who knows how to do the dance of dialectic that you can really arrive at something like knowledge. But that's good, but let me say, having said all that, the big thing that it seems to me is moving Aristotle is to say, and that's great that we're capable of enthymemic demonstration. And Plato understood that, I think he's also saying, and the dialogues show it, and it's only a certain kind of head-in-the-mud Platonist who thinks that somehow we should be all trying to know all the time in our little secluded village, tucked away from the city, preferably with a wall and some armed guards. Bill, and then Adam.
My question consists of one part. Your title promised that you would talk about pedagogy, but I never heard the word in your talk.
Yes. And what inference do you draw from that?
That you want to tell us something about pedagogy, surely.
Or,
That there's not truth in advertising.
well, okay, what's it, right? The title, right, is pedagogy or demagogy. Maybe. No, but I mean, that what I was trying to say is, I mean, I guess what I was trying to do is to encourage us all, encourage myself in thinking about this, and then encourage all of us in listening and talking to one another about it, to reflect on the ways in which we perform those roles every time that we open our mouths. So I guess what the reason why I didn't say why I didn't speak thematically about pedagogy would be like when Aristotle talks about anger in the Rhetoric. My thematic approach to pedagogy would close off the radical indeterminacy of our own reflection on how the pedagogical and the demagogical moment of rhetoric co-inhabit the same space. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that every moment that my voice was carrying in my mind was, if I was at all successful, was an attempt to get us to reflect together about what education consists in. And that the way that we might do that is to hold that thought in conflict with someone who speaks for the sake not of understanding, right, but of being agreed with.
But you speak of peers, whereas pedagogy implies the presence of the young and those older than the young who lead them. And the root has both. I think you should address that fact.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm sure that I failed, because there are thousands of ways to fail and only one way to go right, and human beings never go right. If you've been reading the Ethics, I'm sure you came across that sentence, which is one of the most beautiful ones that I think Aristotle bequeaths to us. But I think that's part, in other words, I guess what I'd like to do is to offer the moment of my speaking as an occasion for us to have exactly that thought. And if we went back, this doesn't deserve, what I did tonight doesn't deserve this kind of attention, frankly. But, in principle, what I'm asking us to consider taking on as a project is to think about our moments of engagement in speaking in public as attempts to really reflect back on each transition within the transcript of that recorded means of communication as operating precisely on this level of being composed by a human being who's reached a certain level of understanding about a certain subject matter for human beings who are at different levels of understanding and preparation for discussion of those matters, right? So use a technical term like dunamit, right? Use a term from another language like dunamit. Maybe we know what that word means, maybe it doesn't. And I tried to give some suggestions about how we might think about that term in English words that I imagine we're all familiar with, but I kind of left that open, right? And that might be one way of thinking about that. So that was a pedagogic moment, the non-translation of dunamis, right? So we could continue talking about that too, and I would be very flattered because that would mean that there was something worth talking about in what I did. But what I would also want to do is say, if there's anything valuable in that project, what that seems to me to call for is precisely the same kind of attention to what we say. Not, and maybe I'm speaking to people who are already convinced, but it feels to me that there's a big drive with the people who recognize the sickness of our society. This came up in Dan's talk in the public speaking class, for those who were there, right? That our society is sick. I recognize that too, but that doesn't mean that we should all get together in a space where we all know that no one's going to get hurt and we're not going to tell lies to each other. That's not going to help anything. So the pedagogy, that's the teaching moment, I suppose, that is to say, I have some experiences that lead me to believe that it's because of a certain inattention and lack of care and even antipathy toward thinking about composed speech that we arrive at this moment. Not because we have too many people who are out there speaking well falsehoods.
I think I can find in Aristotle justification of what you're doing.
Yes.
He says that the young tend to act according to passion.
Yes.
And elsewhere he says, and that's true of most people in general.
Yes.
So what you've done in taking the idea of leading the young is equate the young with those who have not reached the same level of understanding as the speaker or you have. But I'm not sure that the young present in this audience are satisfied with that. That they might want to hear about teaching as between the old and the young, rather than the purely logical person who knows the truth and the mass of human beings of any age who are moved according to passion. Isn't there a distinction, or are they all to be conflated?
But in my heart of heart, what I'd really like to think about is that, in chapters 12 through 17 of Book 2 of the Rhetoric, shortly after the second moment that I reflect on here with anger, Aristotle gives this typology of the characters of listeners, right? And one of the axes, so you have the old, let's give them in order, right? You have the young, you have the old, and you have in the prime of their lives. And that's doing a certain kind of dance with the rich and the powerful. And
the well-born.
And the noble, right, or the well-born, the favored. So I guess that what I want to say is that this strikes me, I think that these chapters, what I really think is that these chapters are a gloss in the Platonic dialogues. And I think that what Aristotle's doing in chapters 12 through 17 is giving a theory of Plato's dialogues. And he's saying that at these moments in his own work, where he uses certain kinds of descriptive typologies that often come in trios of threes, for some reason. They often come in threes of threes, sometimes twos of threes, but very often threes of threes. There's something going on with precisely the conventionality of our notions of assigned roles. One of them would be the teacher and the student. So the super cheesy moment of my remarks this evening would be that the reason why the young and the old play such a set, and in the prime of their life, and no one's in the prime of their life, basically, it's one of these particular formulations that Aristotle gives us. We're all young or old, we're never in the prime of our life. I mean, of course we are, it's a long story. None of us is really in possession of our capacities, I guess, would be the way to say that in a direct way. I do think that he says that. We all have to understand ourselves as, let's say, forever young, something like that. I know it sounds super cheesy. By which we mean, even those of us who've attained the highest degree of sophistication with the rational procedures of dialectic need enthymemic demonstration on many occasions, like when it's time to go. Something like that. There was a hand from someone that I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
And a hand from
I
someone that I
had
do
one
know.
maybe quick question or remark that sort of brought up by these questions. Something I noticed, and maybe I'll start again. It's late. I'll try again. You concentrated on how rhetoric works rather than where it works. But Aristotle actually says a lot about where it works, and I gathered later that was because he wanted to move it everywhere. But I wondered whether, at least acknowledging that he starts with there's a particular place and a particular purpose, right, which rhetoric is designed to. Would change a little bit this discussion, which is turning into, we do syllogisms for smart people and antonyms for all the sleepy people. That's not really what it's about, right? It's about the places for certain types of discourse. So that was just my first comment. And then the question was, I was trying to figure out the real motivation here. And so it came out at the end, if I understand correctly, that you're sort of saying we better pay attention to rhetoric because otherwise we're going to miss the boat or miss the fight or not respond in kind to the sort of political argument that is going on, where rhetoric appears as one possible form of, well, let's say weapon. Okay? And you were sort of saying, let's mobilize it for the side we're on and not let just the other people mobilize it. You can correct me if that's wrong. But I heard that as a, rhetoric is neutral in a way, but let's have the good side take it up. And the reason that struck me is at the end you were also saying rhetoric is kind of the hope. I guess this is a contradiction already in Aristotle's rhetoric, right? He goes back and forth between rhetoric is just an art, it's neutral, and, well, it kind of tends to favor the just more than the unjust. It just so happens that, you know, if you're just and you lose it, it's because you're a bad rhetorician. You know, you haven't learned the art.
It's a lack of art.
But it hesitates between it's neutral and it helps the just more than the unjust. And I just wonder, trying to figure out how that hesitation is working in your motivation for this ecology of rhetoric.
Thanks. So the where question is really crucial. In part because of time, and in part because right. What we didn't talk about is that another of the threes. We talked about a couple of the threes, but what we didn't talk about is that there are three, according to Aristotle, there are three types of rhetoric, all of which are related to this idea of dexis, or showing, but not apodexis, which is rational demonstration, right? And one is appropriate for the courtroom, and one is appropriate for the assembly, and one is appropriate for shows, for display. And that, of course, happens as a matter of geographical location in the Athenian context. That happens in spaces that are predetermined by the other forms of rhetoric. But I mean, what I understand myself to be attempting tonight would be that third form of rhetoric, and I understand the rhetoric itself primarily. I mean, there are places where other things are happening, but the rhetoric, it seems to me that the rhetoric understands itself, I would put it, as the third kind of rhetoric. And the third kind of rhetoric, that kind where you're talking to show off what your talking can do, the way that I understand what epidexis is doing, that can happen anywhere, it seems to me. And so, I mean, I would say, I think that it's a really interesting and important question to think about that taxonomy of deployments of rhetoric, and how that intersects with the artful and the inartful, which came up, right? Probably epidexis is going to require a lot more of the artful, because you don't have props.
I can't remember, isn't that though where you're establishing the character of someone else, right?
Right, you set up...
privileged mode of it. That's a particular kind of enterprise, right? It's a sort of...
It's storytelling, right? And storytelling... Sorry?
Sorry, I'll let you.
No.
Or eulogies. I mean, it's often about setting...
Right, but that's also...
describing the past in such a way that you come to consent on the fact of a past character, right? Was he really a hero?
Yeah, saying what... It's also a form of saying what is, but it's not a form of saying, right, the other two kinds are attempting to talk about something that did or didn't happen. That's what you do in a courtroom, right? Or something that we ought now or ought not to do. So those ones are very determined, and I didn't talk about them tonight because I wasn't trying that tonight. So I don't know, there are lots of ways, as you say, that you fail. When you try to get self-reflexive, you're even more likely to fail. But I guess what I was attempting to do without going into the taxonomy that Aristotle uses in the Rhetoric or describing its perspicacity or, if it has it right or not, is to say, and that gets to the second question, however much I've dealt with the first or not, which is to say like where the motivation is. I guess what I'm saying is that we don't necessarily, I don't have the sense that we need a lot of courtroom or assembly type rhetoric. That's not the way we live. We're not jurors. And we're not primarily, we all duck jury duty, right? And we're not talking to jurors a lot. And we're certainly, I don't think any of us are, maybe some of us will be doing that, and then you should definitely learn that part of the rhetoric. And we're not going to sit in the assembly probably, and I'm not advocating that. Maybe some of us will, maybe some of us should. But what I'm saying is it's the epidexis part of it. That's what I'm saying. We've forgotten how to do that. We don't listen to each other, we don't practice. Just like small children should practice playing an instrument, we should be practicing writing speeches and reading them aloud. And we should be practicing memorizing poems. Things like that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. And I don't know how crazy that is or how disconnected that seems. I honestly and earnestly believe that it's because we don't read poems anymore that our public discourse is so crappy. I don't think it's because the people who believe different things ideologically, that might be stupid and I might be totally wrong, but that's the conviction I've come to. And yes, I want to jump up and down when people who more or less are ideologically disposed in directions that I am think that what we need to do is to be rational with each other.
Does it matter which poems one reads?
Probably.
There's a reason, there's an argument for the fact that our public discourse is crappy, to use your term of art, because of the lack of memorized poems. But one reason is that what memorizing poems does is it teaches in a pedagogical way that Bill was talking about to young people, not to equals, because to teach equals is rude, but to teach to young people the world we live in, and gives people a common world and a common language, which would mean that there would be a need for a kind of canon, which would mean that there would be a certain need for some sort of unified idea of which poems one is going to read. And are you prepared to make that case?
Well, and here's where probably, I sort of painted with...
But are you going to be a pedagogue and actually teach young people what they need to know to be in the world they're in?
So let me say, because I understand that maybe I also haven't been clear about this, when I say that it's a pedagogical moment when people understand themselves more or less to be equals with respect to the power relation in a given discursive environment, I'm not suggesting that I don't believe that there are pedagogical circumstances under which one understands oneself to be in a very unequal relationship with those who are to be educated. Right? All that I'm saying is that we vastly inflate the degree of equality in pedagogical moments that persist among people who status-wise are equal in society. So maybe I understand better too something that might have been opaque in my exchange with Bill. When I say that something like what happened tonight strikes me as pedagogical in the sense that I'm in a pedagogical relationship with myself that I display for certain possible benefits with us here, even though I take us basically all to be in the same standing, that doesn't mean that there aren't also pedagogical situations in which one very much doesn't have the same standing. And so with children, for instance, one doesn't give a speech like the one I've given about the speech that I gave about something, right? So, and that self-reflexivity goes on and on and on. Yes, what I'm saying is that we need to recite poems to one another, and yes, I recognize that means a choice about which poems, and yes, I recognize all kinds of childizing, right, that need to go on in order for that to happen, and putting people in their place, so to speak, right, quite literally, putting the text in place, putting the people who would make those decisions in their place, and that's going to get people's thumos involved. And it's because, that's basically what I'm saying. It's because